Is that, is my screen sharing working? Okay, so I pulled out a couple of highlights from the Declaration of Independence, and it's actually the one on it's the second one that you see highlighted there that I want to emphasize about the right of the people to alter or abolish or institute new government. And of course, in the 1770s, among the Americans, at least those who were in the Patriot movement, in the rebellion against Britain, they did not have the ability to directly influence British policy through political channels. What would become the United States population uh, were not represented directly in Parliament. The British made an argument that there was something they referred to as virtual representation. But, and of course, the Institute of Monarchy, um, that was not something that the Americans could affect either. So as we all know, they ended up taking their form of protest into a violent rebellion, a war, to become independent. So the reason I want to bring this up is that I think the spirit of this declaration is very much alive. And now we do it through voting. And the most important moment along the way in the early part of the story was the election of 1800, when Jefferson, who was a vocal opponent against his former Patriot friend, John Adams, who was a Federalist, and Jefferson was an anti-Federalist. And Jefferson won that election in 1800, and Adams had to leave office and to peacefully hand over the reins of the US government to his political rival. And that happened. That was an altering and a instituting of new government, or at least new people running the government. And so in a way, we can say that the spirit of the Declaration goes on every time you have an election, whether you're voting for your town council, whether you're voting for your governor, or your representatives to Congress, and certainly when you're voting for the President of the United States in that election, that this is a chance to alter and institute new people in government. And so it doesn't always have to be a violent rebellion. And in the United States, that's been happening peacefully now for over 2 centuries. And so I think that, of course, everybody talks about how important this election is today. We all know what a momentous year 2020 has been. But I think it's also important to step back and say that this is how we do the Declaration. This is our generation, our moment to live out the Declaration once again and decide if you want to alter or change government, at least in terms of the people who are serving on your behalf. So that's kind of my opening statement, that I would say on Tuesday next week, we're reenacting the Declaration, but as some of you know, over 50 million Americans have already cast their votes. And so the Declaration is being lived in this way right now. So thanks for your attention to that. That's my opening statement, Cam.
Thank you, Dr. Lawson. Dr. Dennis, do you have an opening?
Not as extensive, but I wanted to explain, what I bring to the table here, because as I think most of you know, I'm a European historian by training, so I make no claim to be the expert in U.S. history that Dr. Lawson is, although I, have followed U.S. politics since I was probably 5 years old. I remember still watching the Iran-Contra hearings in the 1980s over it was a scandal in the Reagan administration. And that was one of my first, moments of political awakening. And I was, very, very young. But in any case, so those, I often bring to these kinds of conversations that I have with friends and family, insight, that there's often a critique of the US system regarding third parties, or why don't we have multiple parties? So I have studied extensively systems in parliamentary systems in Europe where they have multi-party systems, and I'm happy to weigh in on that if you have questions about that. I'm also quite a stats and political geography wonk, and I have some resources I'll share with you guys where I go to get the best modeling on current polling, and also some of the best information on political geography, or one of the best. I'll share that with you later. So happy to talk about those sorts of things, but I'm going to leave a lot of the U.S. history discussion to Dr. Lawson.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Dennis. So again, folks, at any time, feel free to put your questions into the chat or raise your hand. I'm going to get the conversation started with kind of a general question. So Dr. Lawson and Dr. Dennis, as both voters yourselves, what are some things that new voters or people who haven't gone before can expect going into the polls on election day?
Wow, that's a good one. Well, I think that if we talk about, yeah, the level of expectations, it kind of comes down into two ways. One is the actual act of voting, and then the other is like, what is the effect of voting? Not only our own votes, but of course that of all the other people that are voting in our constituencies and communities, depending on what you have on the ballot where you are. I mean, this year, as we mentioned, we're in a pandemic, as everybody knows. And so we have a couple of forces that are at work here. One is that because of the pandemic, there are folks who don't want to physically go to the polls. And so as many of you know, early voting, whether that's actually going to the poll in less than, a large crowd like you often have on election day, or whether that's sending in a mail-in ballot or absentee ballot. So that's changed. I think that's really changing. That's making this year a very interesting type of election. Now, I always, since you frame this, Cam, as voters, I really enjoy what I consider a sort of sacred act of going to the poll on election day. I've always, oh, it looks like we got someone who's trying to get in here. I don't know if you see that, Brian.
I'll do the waiting room so you
got it. Okay, great. So that to me is a really important thing to do. Now, for me personally, I don't mind going to the poll this year because, in full disclosure, like I go to the supermarket and I practice all of the social distancing and masking and hygiene things that help us during the pandemic. So I'll be doing that. What I think, if you're doing that for the first time, I think that what you can expect is kind of an interest. I mean, if we have first-time voters here and you're going to go to vote, I think what you can expect is a sense of excitement and nervousness. I mean, you are having your voice heard. You are, and it's very important that we do what's known as the Australian ballot. We're doing this these are secret votes, right? No one knows what you are doing when you pull the curtain there. And I find that always to be a very energizing moment. It's always kind of what my mother would call like a sweaty palm moment, because you as an individual person are getting to have your voice heard. You're getting to make your mark and say, this is what I think, this is a person that I want to represent me and represent my community. So if you go and and if you feel nervous, like, I think that's very normal. I've been doing it for a long time. The 1992 election, Clinton and Bush, that was the first election I voted in. And I just turned 18 like a month before, not even a month before that election. So I was really excited. And yeah, that feeling is one that I still get. Hopefully you live in a community where you don't have too much disruption in or around your polling places. Everywhere I've lived, I've always found it to be a very solemn, it's people quietly going in and doing their civic duty. I love that moment. Looking forward to it next Tuesday.
Yeah, I'll just add to that very briefly. And I think it is important. I agree fully. It's a fantastic experience, and it's a solemn experience, and it always feels powerful. And my first election, I think I was a sophomore or maybe I was a junior in college. I forget, but it was the 2000 election, the infamous Bush v. Gore. And that was an election that took actually, I think, a month to decide because of some of the court battles, because it was so close. And I know that's there's a lot of discussion about what if that happens this year. So I would encourage you guys to look back at that moment and remember that the United States has been through these very tough and very close elections before. The other thing I think is as much of a public service announcement than anything else, because there are active disinformation and misinformation campaigns ongoing regarding mail-in voting. It is a safe and effective method of voting. It is not corrupt. It is study after study from actual experts has shown that it's a very effective means of voting. The states of Washington and Oregon have been doing it effectively for decades. And there have not been problems overall. There are small problems here and there, of course, and that's true of any system, but they do not impact the outcome. So if you're in a situation where you feel that you need to do a mail-in ballot, then you should feel comfortable and confident that that will work. So.
Yeah, I think that's really important because, one of the things that this year, we're living through a digital revolution. This has been going on really strongly since the 1990s. Now, I know if you're 18, 19, 20 years old, that seems like a long time. But from a historian's point of view, this is something that's happened very, very rapidly. I could, as a person who's over 40, I could tell you like what our lives were like before the internet. And by the way, we could survive. We were happy. We were not empty wondering like, where's the chat room or why don't we have fantasy football? We were perfectly normal. But the point I want to make is that we're living through things that are in many ways new and different, and in some cases unprecedented. And the role of digital communication and the amount of access that so many people have to put out information and misinformation, as Dr. Dennis pointed out, this is a challenge for us and something that because of the role that the internet plays in our lives and social media, this is a challenge that is new and different in many ways. On the other hand, as Dr. Dennis said, if the election is not decisive on election evening, which in my lifetime, with the exception of 2000, it always has been, don't panic. The 2000 election, as Dr. Dennis mentioned, is very instructive. That took at least a month to sort it out. It was done through the Supreme Court. And prior to that, we had even more, what you might think of as like chaotic. Now you do have to go back a ways to like the 1870s where we had an election that actually had to be voted in the House of Representatives because no candidate could reach the needed threshold of winning the Electoral College. And so the House of Representatives voted on the presidency. And that was in 1876, 77. But I mentioned that, and you might say, oh my gosh, that's so long ago. Our world is totally different than that. How can we learn from it? I would point you to the influenza of 1918. We thought that was something that was distant from us, something that was for the history books and not for our lives. And how much have we all looked back to 1918 now, living through a pandemic with COVID-19? So I think that history is there to help us when we are in uncertain times. We are not the first people to go through the human experience, and we need to learn from our ancestors, learn from our predecessors who have gone through tumultuous things. So again, yes, if the election is not decisive on November 3rd because of counting of absentee ballots or mail ballots or if there are court challenges, don't panic. But do get the right, good information. Don't just, I know it's so habitual these days to just Google something and grab whatever comes up first or whatever comes in your social media feed. Ask yourself, do those processes lead you to the best information? And not necessarily, right? Got to research, got to do some digging.
So other questions that have emerged for you guys? I think Nicholas has a question.
Yes. My question is, since we all know everything is a social construct, Is voting even necessary? Democracy is a construct, therefore voting is a construct. And since we all have our own biases, voting for someone who who may the people have voted for, they may just entirely disregard why they were voted in the first place and take their own biases and put in a policy that aligns with their own. So I raise you all the question of, is voting even necessary if it's all a social construct?
Well, I can jump in on this one, Nicholas, because I completely understand where you're coming from, and I suspect I know where this is. I know you're in critical theory right now, and I remember very clearly when I was going through the learning of this idea about a social construct, which, of course, is the prevailing viewpoint among social theorists right now. It doesn't mean that it's the absolute truth. So there's a little bit of meta thought there for you. Obviously, you can have a Kantian approach to truth that's very different from this kind of social construct vision. But that being said, what I was confused on for a long time when I was trying to learn this concept was, and it took me a long time to get, there's a difference between social construct and fake. I think that sometimes it comes across as that something is social construct, and so therefore it's not real. Social constructs are very real. In fact, they're all around us. On some level, I suppose you could argue that this whole conversation we're having is a construct, but nonetheless, we're having it. So, and they're important, and they do impact us and their systems. So in that sense, I say, yes, this is the system we are in. It is constructed, but voting is important, whether or not it's a construct. All government systems are constructed because they're all human. There's nothing natural about them. Rather than asking, are they a social construct, I would ask, what are the outcomes? What are the inputs and the outcomes of these systems? How do they improve our lives? How do they make societies more stable? Or how do they not? How do they make societies more unstable? So I think that's a better question. But the social construct piece is there to help us think critically about them, right? And say, okay, do we need to adjust them some way?
And you raise another point too, Nicholas, which is what if, and you're right. I mean, what if you vote for someone based on a set of ideas about what you think they're going to do regarding policy and regarding governing, and perhaps that person who you voted for may not do exactly what you thought, right? This is completely common. And there's no guarantee that when you vote for someone that they're going to do what you thought. I'll give you the case of William Henry Harrison back in the I didn't memorize the presidents. William Henry, 1830.
Right? Wasn't it 1840?
40, yes, thank you, 1840. Okay, so a bunch of people voted for him, and he was elected president, and he died like 3 weeks into his presidency. And they ended up with John Tyler, who people did not vote for him for president. And he had almost a full 4-year, term. So yes, just because you're voting for someone, they may not do what you think they're going to do. You often have instances where presidencies, or even in state government, where everything hinges on something that changes. I think that instructive there would be the case of George W. Bush. He was elected eventually, as we pointed out, in 2000 after the Supreme Court decision that his certification of the vote in Florida was the correct one, and thus put him over the top. A few months into his presidency, September 11th happened, right? And that whole presidency got shifted, and the national priority shifted because of that event. So where does that leave you as the voter? You then get to decide next time around whether this is your county commissioner or whether this is your governor or your senator or your president. You get to decide, is this a person who I want to hire for this job again? This happens in the real world, I guess, or any other setting too. You hire somebody and it turns out not to be what you want, and you get to make some choices. You maybe sign up for a class and you say, ooh, this isn't what I wanted to do. Are we still in the drop period? And you might drop a class. So I think that this is, think of it more of like a cycle where Dr. Dennis said like inputs and outputs. I think that's quite right. You're putting an input in, which is, this is my choice, this is my vote. You're getting an output, which is, this is what the person's doing or not doing. You get to have another input 2 years or 4 years later, depending on the election cycle. And so you get to reflect on that and decide, is that a person who I continue to support? I like this, or is this something I don't like? I want to go in a different direction.
Okay, then. Okay. Thank you
That's a
very
good
much,
question, by
Professor.
the way.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions from students or anyone at all?
Yeah, I have a question. So I know lately there's been a lot of discoveries in different ways with people caught on camera or people admitting it themselves. But there's been a lot of discoveries of voting fraud, of mail-in voting fraud. But a lot of people have been denying that. And I know obviously some people just haven't seen the proof of that. But I've talked to people who have seen the proof and they still deny it. What do you think about that? And is that like, that's a new thing, right? I mean, this hasn't happened in the past, at least as much.
So I this is, yeah, I think this is a good question, and I'll, this is what I was speaking about earlier about some misinformation. So, and it's Alexandria. So when you're talking about evidence of fraud or evidence of anything, this is one of the things we hope that you guys will take away from your college experience. This is why we make you do so many research papers where you have to identify good information from not so good information. You have to think about, okay, what is an anecdote versus what is, the general pattern, okay? So when you say people have told you, or you've heard this information or that information, that is anecdotal. Anything that many things have happened, right? You can always find an anecdote, right? One anecdote means one story about something, right? But that's not a pattern of fraud, right? And the problem with what's happening right now is that there are active campaigns of disinformation, and that means a malicious intent to spread disinformation about mail-in ballots in order to disrupt the election. And so let me assure you that there is no evidence of major patterns of voter fraud or problems with mail-in ballots. It is an established method of doing this. Like I said, the states of Oregon and Washington have been using mail-in ballots as their main primary way of doing elections for decades. And the minute any kind of information in terms of fraud is minuscule. And in fact, voter fraud in general is a phenomenon that study after study have shown happens on such a tiny scale that it's still shocking as to why we're still talking about it. But there is a political agenda at work, and there's an international political agenda, specifically from Russia. Russia has been behind parts of these misinformation campaigns, but there are also people within the United States and political movements in the United States that are trying to use this to discourage people from voting or to question the outcome of the election. Okay, so you should rest assured that mail-in voting is safe. It is not with zero problems, but in terms of patterns, the patterns just aren't there of voter fraud. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I would
And if
add
you
to
want
that as well.
oh,
Go
I'm
ahead.
happy to share resources if you want to. I can help you out.
Yeah, I mean, on a sort of broader kind of level, I think as Dr. Dennis was talking about anecdotal evidence, if a person says, well, I heard this, or I saw this, or I've had this story, there's something to think about, which is And Dr. Dennis is really good at this because he's really good with thinking of things numerically and through a quantitative analysis. But it's kind of like, I would take an example like smoking, for example. I think anyone could say, okay, I know my grandmother lived to 95 years old and she smoked a pack of cigarettes every day of her life. Okay, I'm not, yes, your grandmother lived to be 95 and she smoked every day of her life. But when we look at the larger aggregate of data, it's pretty clear that if you smoke a pack of cigarettes per day, you're likely to have some really negative health outcomes. And I think this is where we are with the social media and the internet and just circles of communication, even if it's in person. We all have individual stories. We all hear stories. And those individual instances may be true, just like grandma lived to be 95 as a heavy smoker. But when we look at the larger pools of data, the larger sets of data, and I think this is what Dr. Dennis is speaking to, we still know that smoking's bad. And we still know that voting by mail or absentee voting does not cause widespread problems. I will tell you this as a political observer, this subject came up very, very specifically at a very specific time. It came up very specifically within the last 12 months. In fact, actually the last 8 months when the polling, especially when the pandemic hit, when the polling for President Trump began to drop. And that is specifically when the claims, and especially when the pandemic and people were looking forward to the election and said, looks like we're going to need to do a lot of mail-in voting this year. That is exactly where the critique of mail-in voting began. So when we put those two things together, it supports the idea that the criticism of mail-in voting has more to do with politics than it has to do with what our experience with it has been in the past. The most important thing to me about voting is that, I'll go back to the point that it's secret, that no matter whether you're mailing it or whether you're going in person, no one has to know who you're choosing. That's so vitally important. You can have every family member in your family saying, you gotta vote for this way or that way. You can have your boss tell you, if you don't vote for my candidate, you're fired. You can have your religious leader, your imam, your priest, your pastor, your rabbi say, well, they probably shouldn't because they're nonprofit institutions and they're not supposed to be doing this. But let's say you have a religious leader who tells you, you have to vote for this candidate. None of those people will know who you vote for. That is between you and the ballot. And I think that's the most important thing. I mention this because historically it hasn't always been this way. In the United States, we used to have elections which were highly public, where people had to go into a room, or they had to, in front of everybody, hand in a ballot, or they had to check a box in front of everybody else. You used to have widespread voter fraud in this country. It used to happen particularly in cities where you had industrial, this happened a lot, like in the steel, the coal, and the iron industries, where the bosses of the company would march all their workers in and tell them who they had to vote for, and they could watch and see who they voted for, and those who voted the wrong way would be fired or worse. So the fact that we do secret ballots is the best protection against voter fraud, because it used to be quite widespread, but that was because it was public and people could control you. And then they used to do another thing. If you go further back, this was, I mean, kind of maybe fun, but I'm not so sure it was good for the integrity of elections. They used to throw giant barbecues, and they'd roll out barrels of whiskey and rum and roast pigs, and they'd say, come over and vote for our candidate. And they would entice you with liquor and barbecue sandwiches, and then you'd vote right there at their tent. So we don't do that. I'm sure those were great parties. I'm not sure that you're going to choose the best candidate on, who's got the best whiskey or who knows how to roast a pig the best. What does that mean for tax policy, foreign affairs, or, other issues? But in any event, I think I will go back to say that if you look at where the claims of fear about mail-in voting, when that conversation started, you can trace it to some specific events that were happening polling with our presidential election.
Okay, thank you. And I'm guessing it would be illegal to, like, say, if you were a mailman, if you somehow got a hold of a bunch of ballots, I'm guessing it would be illegal to, like, somehow check those, right?
That's absolutely illegal. Just like it would be illegal for if if you're my landlord and I'm sending you my rent, it would be illegal for them to take the money out of the envelope, right, and not give it to you. So, yeah, I mean, we send all kinds of confidential things through the mail. In fact, I think that any cybersecurity expert, I don't know if we have anybody in here who's a cybersecurity major or a Homeland Security major. My suspicion would be that you are safer sending your private information through the post mail than you are sending it in an email or putting it on a website, right? Or all the times we jump on the phone and we're like, oh, here's my credit card and let me make an order. I think that electronic transmission of data is more susceptible to fraud than if you put an actual check or cash in the mail or your social security number in the mail. You'll also notice, just again, if you scan the news, there has been a lot of assault on the efficiency and validity of our postal service over the same exact period of time, going back 8 months. Prior to that, discussions about the validity or efficiency of our postal service, that didn't exist. You wouldn't find that in news searches in 2016, 17, 18, but in 2019, 2020, you'll see that. So I do think, I agree with Dr. Dennis that there's quite a lot of political motivation for those discussions, but that's really, really important for us to talk about. So, and it's not the easiest thing to talk about. So Alexandria, I really appreciate that you asked that, bring that up. That's great.
What other questions? Because I can certainly share some of my numbers, my wonky numbers websites that I like to show people. But I'll pause for a second, make sure there are no questions that have come up so far.
I see something that Cam has put. What resources do you recommend to learn who's running for office, research issues, or see voting laws? Right. So one of the things I would generally say here is you want to rely on your public officials. And I'm gonna put this over here in the chat. .govs are good. .gov sites are good, and the reason I say that is they're accountable. I would say this about your news sources, right, where you're getting information from. Ask this simple question about old school journalism. If the person that is giving you information on a website or social media, tweet or Facebook share, if this person provides you inaccurate information or is outright lying, would they get fired for doing that? Right? If I go out and I say, Dr. Dennis is well, no, I would get fired because we live in a world of we live in academia, a world that's supposed to be based on truth. But what I'm saying is this: if someone's Facebook messages you or you read a tweet and it's got information in it that could be misleading or wrong, if I'm a private citizen and I tell you that, oh, there's this conspiracy that the country is being overrun by some secret organization, and I'm just tweeting that. Okay, if that's not right, would I get fired for it? No, I'm just a person sharing information. I'm just a person asking questions. But if I'm a journalist and I work for a serious organization, or I'm a historian and I work for a serious organization like Dean College, if I go in and lie to you or tell you things that I know aren't true, I should be fired. That's not my job. That's not what you're paying for. When you subscribe to a newspaper, when you pay for a subscription to a news network or news outlet, what you're paying for is for them to give you the truth. And so .govs are good. The reason I say that is if I'm a mayor or I'm just a civil servant working in a government office, you get to vote for me. You get to vote for my bosses. And if it turns out that I'm abusing my privilege to access, to put out information on a .gov, you as a voter have power over that. That person or the person who hired them can get voted out. If I'm a .com, I mean, you could boycott my website, you could ignore my website, but you can't stop me from spreading lies or misinformation if I'm a .com. It could also be a .org. I mean, .orgs tend to be pretty decent, but they are nonprofit organizations. They may be serving political or social agendas that you may or may not support. But a .gov, you get to vote for those people or their bosses. And that's not true in .coms. Also remember, social media sites are not civic entities. They are for-profit individual businesses. So if you want to trust Twitter and Facebook as for-profit businesses to give you information, you're free to do that, but you can't fire Mark Zuckerberg. You can't affect them other than with whether you want to use their service or not. So I think .govs is a good place where you can get information, because those people have to be accountable. Could they be fired for lying to you? Great question to ask.
Yes, I totally agree. And I just put in the chat room for you guys. So there's nothing wrong with getting information from YouTube or TikTok or Facebook, but you want to check that, especially when the stakes are so high as they are in an election in general, any election, because anybody can put anything that they want. Any claim can be made on these networks, right? These social media networks. And that doesn't mean that everything that's on there is wrong. There are quality things, but there are already organizations dedicated to providing you the best high quality news and information as possible. And these organizations where if you are a reporter and you lie intentionally, or you make up a source, like that will come out, and people have been fired, and they do get fired for doing this if this happens. So the best places to go are your legacy newspapers and their online websites. I would avoid the cable news networks because they are not because they're bad, their opinion. They are political opinion networks for the most part. So I would go to, if and it doesn't matter what their perceived political bias is. There may be political bias here or there, but for a conservative example, the Wall Street Journal, phenomenal newsroom, excellent journalism, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the LA Times, any of the, and then your local papers too, by the way. Sometimes local papers, I know Dr. Lawson has told me the story about the local newspaper in his hometown and how, focused they are on getting the story right. But even when you're there, you want to differentiate between their opinion page and their hard newsroom. And they do too, by the way. So totally separate. The opinion page of these organizations are very separate. That's where you can editorialize. That's where you provide political commentary. Whereas the newsroom staff, they're totally separate, and they work under a different set of constraints and assumptions, right? And that assumption is that they're giving you the best fact-based story that they can, as opposed to when you read an editorial. Okay, so that's where I go. And it looks like Professor Reed has a great source.
So I just posted to the chat. It's the League of Women Voters, which is a great resource. But this specific link, there's an infographic embedded in it that I've used when I've taught government that kind of gets at media bias. And so you kind of what's the hardest news coverage based on original reporting, rigorous journalistic research, and that is more center, so more balanced, versus either very, very left-wing, completely unreliable, or very, very right-wing, completely unreliable. And I've used this a lot in my classes, and it's been helpful because you can get a sense, because sometimes things pop up, particularly on social media. It's like, well, look, that sounds like a legit news source, and it's not necessarily. So it can be a great grounding reference that I just offer to you.
Yeah, and to add to that, a source that I really or sources that I really like, and I do read a small town local newspaper because they are part of the community and they're accountable. I mean, if they, we know who the editors are. I mean, they're members of our community. If they're putting out falsehoods, then that's going to come home to roost because we'll say, "Hey, Bill, that's what are you doing?" That's not real news. They don't do that partly for that reason. I think another thing that's really interesting, and it's so easy now because of the internet, is to read news sources from other countries, right? Because if you think of this, if you are a New York or LA or Dallas based or whatever, American news organization, you might have a bias politically because you support one party or the other, or hold one view or the other. The beautiful thing about some of the, English language international press, as you see in the chat there, is that they can't vote in our elections. They are reporting to their audiences who want to know what's going on, not because they're trying to convince someone to support one party or the other, one candidate or the other, because they can't vote for those people. Another is if you look at some of the financial news organizations, because they're trying, let's be frank, they're capitalists. They're trying to make money, right? They want to know what's going on. It doesn't matter to them so much what the political outcomes are. They're trying to decide where to invest money, like what are the policies? What's an attractive investment environment for our corporation or our capital fund? So you're seeing some of these pop up. I used to really like the Financial Times was one that I would read quite a bit. I haven't read it in a while. But in any event, I think international press is fascinating because you can really get to see how people are looking at our society as opposed to from the inside. And you all know the old you all know the old phrase in English of you can't see the forest for the trees. And sometimes when you're in the society itself, it's kind of hard to see what's really going on. If you can get that viewpoint from outside of the society, then that might give you a different viewpoint, a different.
Other questions?
Was anybody
wanna
wondering about
share-
specific policies or specific issues that you wanted to talk about? Anything that you were like, what's really going on with that? Or where can I learn about that? Anything?
Maybe one that I can bring up that'll help spark conversation, at least in Massachusetts, but it's good to know everywhere. Yes, Rochelle, ranked choice voting. Could either of you explain what that system would look like and what it is?
Yes, I'm happy to do so. This is the numbers bit. Yeah, ranked choice voting is currently in operation in several cities in the United States, and I forget which ones, but the state of Maine has begun to use that as well. It's sometimes also called an instant runoff election. So what you do is you walk into to the voting booth if ranked choice voting has been approved, and you select. You order the candidates, right? Your first choice, second choice, third choice. Let's just say there's 8 candidates running, right? You can put them down in any order, or you can leave them off, or you can say none of them, But let's just say you are very passionate about the environmental movement, okay, and you would like to vote for the Green Party, but you live in a swing state where you're afraid that your vote's going to be lost, right? But so you vote for another left-leaning candidate just because you think they have a better chance of winning. So under the current system, then that makes sense. But if you had ranked choice voting, you could put the Green Party person first, and you could put your kind of second choice second, and then so on and so forth. So what happens is when all that data comes in, right, the votes all come in, they have an algorithm that goes through and they tabulate the votes, and the person of the 8 with the lowest amount of votes is dropped off and then their votes are redistributed across the other 7 candidates as a second choice. Okay, and then those numbers go up, and that process happens again, right? They drop off the 7th person and the 6th person until somebody gets above 50%. So that means with ranked choice voting, you will always have a candidate who the majority of people want. Okay, as opposed to a plurality, meaning more than 50%. And it also means that you get these instantaneous kind of runoffs, right? So it's like you don't have to go back to the ballot, later if there's a runoff, for a candidate. So hopefully that was clear. I don't know, Dr. Lawson or Professor Reed, do you want to jump in? Did I miss anything? So it's a way of valuing diversity of opinion and people who want to vote for third party or independent candidates without also creating a situation where somebody who only 20 or 30% of the voters really wanted ends up being the winner just because they got the most, even if that was, like most people didn't want them.
Yeah, there's a couple historical examples, and then there's something kind of deeper that's important about this too. And I think that is a very good explanation of, because this issue is on the ballot in Massachusetts this time around. So if you live in the Commonwealth and you're voting, that's something you'll be asked to, or you have the opportunity to make your point. There have been instances where third-party candidates have had an important role because what they've done is they will draw candidates or draw voters who otherwise would vote for Democrats or Republicans. And so a couple of relatively recent examples of this was the Ross Perot phenomenon in the 1990s. He was a candidate who was running very much as a business person. He was an independent. He had amassed enormous amount of wealth in the oil and gas industry. And he ran very well. He got 18% of the national vote in 1992, and he got 11% of the national vote in 1996. Bill Clinton, as a Democrat, won both of those elections. And one of the critiques from the right, from the Republicans, were that Ross Perot was stealing votes who otherwise would have voted Republican because of the business interests and the way that they had postured themselves. Similarly, in 2000, you had a third-party candidate, Ralph Nader, who had a long career in consumer protection and consumer advocacy, a champion of individual worker rights. And many voters who otherwise probably would have voted Democratic, would have voted for Al Gore, they voted for Nader. And that was a very important third-party candidate because Gore ended up losing that election. And so these third-party voters, often by supporting the person that they really like the most, they end up helping the candidate that they like the least. And so there's some historical examples of this. So I think that's why you're seeing it coming up now, to try to allow people to speak to their truth of what they really believe in, but not to have a political mechanism that ends up kind of shooting them in the foot. There was a kind of a larger point I wanted to make about that, but I think the historical examples are good enough to show you why this has come up as an issue.
Yeah, so in 2016 was another example. Donald Trump only won because of the presence of, he won for some reasons, but he won because of the presence of third-party candidates in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. There was enough of a difference where it would have changed because it was so minuscule in terms of the numbers. So that's one reason, by the way, why this issue of ranked choice voting is coming to the foreground, because we have a president who, while he won the Electoral College, lost the popular vote by a considerable amount, 3 million votes. So, that was I think a key issue that's now coming to the forefront.
That's important because in many recent elections, we've had candidates who have garnered less than half of the popular vote who have won. Now, our Electoral College is set up that way. None of these elections has been illegitimate in that sense. The founders created the Electoral College, and that's been our pattern ever since. However, I think from a political standpoint, it does matter if the person who has won the election did not garner a majority of votes. And I think that's important, because what that means is that there's at least half of the people who would not have selected the person who's ruling. And just imagine, well, you don't have to imagine, like that's what we live with in many elections. I mean, that happened in 2000, it happened in 2016. And so that creates if you're asking like, why are our politics today so divisive? Why do the stakes seem so high? Why is there, well, there's a lot of reasons for that. Social media is a big one. As I said before, we're living through this digital revolution. However, I do think that it matters when you have leaders who have not been supported by the majority of the people. I mean, that just, you can easily imagine like what that means if you don't have popular mandates. The question of why we still have the Electoral College. Okay, the reason for that is, and I don't make predictions, but I would be very surprised if the Electoral College was going anywhere anytime soon, because it protects the power of states that have smaller populations. So if you're in a small population state, like an Iowa or Nebraska or Delaware, then you would be giving up your voice. It's almost like saying, well, we should have no equity in the Senate. Right? Like every state gets 2 senators, no matter how big or small it is. So you might say, well, why don't the people in the big states overpower the people in the smaller states and get rid of this? When the Constitution was created, it had to be voted by 9 of the 13 original states. That same ratio exists for constitutional amendments. This would require a constitutional amendment. That means you need 2/3 of the states to approve dismantling the Electoral College. And many of those 2/3 of the states are the ones who are seeing an outsized influence based on population. So the political calculus of this, the way our Constitution is constructed, is that it would be shocking to see the smaller states give up the power that they have. I mean, and you know, I know it's frustrating for people who live in the larger population states, but this was the design dating back to 1787, and that was the structure that was put in place. And yeah, the votes just won't be there because it would require, and I think blah, blah, blah. I mean, yeah, you're just not going to see small states vote to give up their power.
Yeah, I think it would take a kind of popular movement on the level of what we saw in the 19 teens, 20s, and 30s, a government accountability or overhaul sort of movement, because that was the last time you saw some real momentum behind these kinds of structural changes to the Constitution. So until something like that happens that kind of overcomes some of the vested interests, and in this case, Dr. Lawson's right, the vested interest is the interest of a small state, whether liberal or conservative. You know, Vermont is equally small as South Dakota. So and South Dakota is a very conservative state. Vermont is the most liberal state in the country. So, you'd have to have that a popular movement to overcome that kind of vested interest. And it has happened before, but it takes a special kind of moment in history for that to happen.
Yeah, and I think also it's, there have been some, I'm going to use like small d, like democracy improvements that were important. Dr. Dennis just mentioned the 19 teens and 20s. That's when they changed the system so that citizens vote for their senators. Prior to this, I mean, even in, I can't give you any specifics off the top of my head, but even presidential elections, I mean, we have the electors who are supposed to follow what the popular vote is, but generally your local elections were the most important, because if the people you elected to your state House of Representatives and your state senators would be voting on behalf of the whole state for who those senators should be, or who the president should be. So this reform has made it more democratic. I don't mean like Democratic Party, but like small d democracy. But this is one, right, and then this is where you say we are not truly like a pure democracy. I mean, if we were, then every vote would count the same. But this was a fascinating debate that James Madison had with the other framers of the Constitution back in the summer of 1787. And they said, no, states do matter. States are units. And that is why we still have this. Yeah, not likely to. Yeah, it would take a lot. It would really take a. It would really take a big. It would really take a lot to change that.
So I think we're running out of time. I wanted to share with you guys two resources, especially if you really get into, if you're interested in the polling. And I'll just say really quickly that the polls were not wrong in 2016. The models were basically right. There was not enough data on some crucial battleground states. It was all within so all the stuff where people are saying the polls were wrong, they were not. It was within the standard deviators, within I'm blanking on the term. I used to do probability and stats all the time, but it was within the range, right, of error, okay, that could have happened. But I think there's a really great resource, 538.com. It has one of the best predictive models. Statistical models are not reality, right? It's just like the odds when you walk into a casino, right? You have a 1 in blah, blah, blah chance of winning versus the house has this much, but so don't take it as like, oh, well, just because right now Joe Biden is ahead in the polls that he's definitely going to get it because he's got an 80% chance or 85% chance. And that's what he has right now. That still means that Donald Trump has a 1 in 8 chance of winning the election. Okay. So, and that's not an insignificant chance. So, but check out 538.com. It has a great modeling source. And Nate Silver, by the way, who's their kind of the head of that website, he's also a sports wonk. So he does a lot of sports stats. So if you're into sports stats, it's a great place to go there as well. And the other thing I wanted to end with, and this, I'm going to share my screen. I hope that we can do this really quickly because.
Just real quick, Nate Silver is an amazing follow on Twitter.
Yes.
If you're on Twitter, follow Nate Silver. It's one of the best accounts out there.
Yes, he's fantastic. And the statistical work that he and his team do, I'm always in awe of it. And they're very transparent on what their model is, how it's built from a statistical standpoint. And they try to make it where you don't have to have an advanced degree in math to understand what they're talking about. But also, let's see, am I sharing? Yeah. Can you guys see that? There's 538.com. Can you guys see this? And then what I wanted to show you though, this for me, and this is at the NewYorkTimes.com, they have wonderful political graphics. Please do, regardless of your opinion of the New York Times, their graphics department is phenomenal. And they create these beautiful graphics that help you understand things about politics. And obviously, and this is the 2016 election results, it is detailed down to the precinct level. You can zoom in not just to the county, or you can look at the precinct level. And what I wanted to remind us all is that even in the bluest of places, there are still voters who are red voters, if we want to identify in that way, which is, there's still people who have, different opinions. And even in the reddest of places, there are still people who are, vote for Democrats. So I'll show you really quickly. This is where I'm from. And you notice it's the reddest part of the country. Let me see if I can zoom in better.
This is great, David, to show this. And what I'm always talking about with people, even if you go back to 1789 and the constitutional vote, this phenomenon of rural versus urban, this is really where it's at. It's at the district level. It's not the state level where you get the most insights. This is fantastic to show.
Well, I want to show you here, my sister and brother-in-law, they live in Borger. They live in Texas, northern Texas. It's the most conservative district in the country. And that's by the Cook Political Report, which kind of measures partisanship and partisan lean. But even here, even where they live, right, even though it's very red, 20% of the people voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, okay? So keep that in mind, especially, and that maybe that's not necessarily where we are, but if you zoom out and you go, let's see if we go up here to, and I love this, by the way, I sit here all the time and I look at, it's fascinating to see the voting patterns at the precinct level. Let's look up here, you know, at Massachusetts, it looks very different, right? Not so red, very pink or blue.
Right.
There's the college, you know, Franklin sits on
Oh,
a,
it's not
you know,
caught up
kind
to
of
you,
a,
David. It's like lagged. We're not seeing that yet.
Oh.
It's
can you see it?
okay. There we go. Now we see Woonsocket and okay. Now you've got your,
So,
yep.
you know, here's Franklin. Like, you know, Franklin is still a fairly, you know, Democratic leaning area of the state, just like in general Massachusetts is, but there's still a significant number of people who in the Franklin area who voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And if you come into the city where I live, and you know, downtown big urban centers tend to be the bluest of blue, right? And let's see if I can find my precinct. It's somewhere in here. Well, it doesn't matter. It's all the same, you know. But you know, even in here, I think this is Jamaica Plain, which is near where I live. Even in the kind of, this is the most liberal area of the city of Boston, you still have other people who are still voting for Donald Trump. So keep that in mind. That means that we're all here together on some level. And that secret ballot is very important because it gives people the freedom to express themselves whenever they live in areas where their views are not the dominant view. And, you know, I think it's also a lesson in civility as well. Like, we are all in this together, even if we disagree. We're neighbors, we're co-workers, you know, but I think this is cool. So check it out. It's one of the parts of the New York Times website is behind a paywall, but this one is public, so you can check it out. And I put it in the chat. So that's all I wanted to show. I'll stop sharing.
I think that is a perfect place to end. Dr. Lawson, Dr. Dennis, thank you for coming out and giving some of the best information I've heard in a while about general voter information. And thank you, students and fellow faculty, for coming today.
Thanks, Cam.
Thank you for requesting this. This was fantastic. I'm really glad that you all could be here, and I'm sure I speak for Dr. Dennis as well. If you want to keep conversations going, you can find us. Our emails are simple. R. Lawson at Dean, D. Dennis at Dean. Always happy to keep the conversations going, and yeah, this is it's really something. If this is your first election and you're voting, you will have a really notable one to say, that was my first election. Kind of like when Dr. Dennis was saying, the 2000 election, that was a big deal. And this one is too. So really glad that y'all were motivated to come out here and be with us today. Thank you.
And we'll likely do something after the election just to discuss and break down and see if Dr. Dennis and Dr. Lawson are available.
Let us know.
Thank you, everyone.
Great day.
Thank you. Thank you very much, professors. Thank you.